Joanne, why don't you tell me about when you met David?
Well, these friends of mine, well, David was staying with one of the friends, one of the men friends. They were our mutual friends. And one of them had told me at one time, he said, you know, you ought to date David Regal when he comes back to town. He's a nice, Jewish, stable kind of guy, not one of these kooks that you are messing around with, not one of these psychiatrists. You ought to look for somebody like that. And meanwhile, this other guy and I were dating. But I wasn't interested in him, and obviously he wasn't interested in me either. And so before I know it, David calls me one day, and he's in town, he wants to go out. And I was also not interested in a long-distance boyfriend. Enough of that. I wanted somebody local. And he wanted me to go out, and I was not interested. And so I said, well, you know, I really am going to this social work meeting tonight. I cannot miss it. And what else did you say? You said something
well, she couldn't go with me because she had to go to the social work meeting. And I said, well, how about picking you up after the meeting is over? No, she couldn't do that. She was going with her friend Francis. And so my friend I.B., with whom I was staying, he was my former roommate and best friend, and he hears Francis, and I say to him that Joanne's going to be with Francis, and he said, oh, I know Francis, I'll ask her out. Well, so Joanne had just about run out of excuses, so after the social work meeting was over, I.B. and I picked them up, and we went to the Bayou Bar at the Pontchartrain Hotel. And that's where we had our first date. And what did we look up? You looked up, that was in January of 1960. I think, did you say January 29th, I think?
I don't know what date
1960. Well, so we went out, and I don't know, we might have had another date or two at that time.
No, you called and wanted to go out. You said, why didn't you came down for Mardi Gras for the weekend. It was in February. And so
we went out, and
we spent the weekend, you know, virtually most time together.
So by April.
No, the next month was March, and you called up and you said you were coming. You wanted to come visit again. Right?
Right. And we had, the dates we wrote down yesterday when you were looking it up, I think we were engaged in April.
Yeah.
March or April of 1960.
End of March we were engaged. I don't know how
and
we
we got married May 3rd, 1960.
It was crazy.
Which
was crazy.
I don't think either one of us knew
each other
whether we loved the other one or not. But we married, and we managed. I guess we learned to love each other, and it's lasted for over 50 years now. So I
thought you loved me.
From my standpoint, it was a real good thing. Best thing I ever did.
I'd say that's my feeling too. Best thing we ever did.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the ISJL Virtual Vacation. My name is Nora Katz, and I'm the Director of Heritage and Interpretation at the Institute of Southern Jewish Life. I think we can all agree love is in the air. And as I got to thinking about this romantic time of year, I started wondering, what do love and romance look like in the Jewish South? How have Southern Jews connected to their partners, and how has that changed over time? What kinds of community norms and attitudes have had an impact on Southern Jews' romantic relationships? I want to pull back the curtain a little bit on the process of researching and developing this episode. In working on this project and diving into current scholarship on these topics in American Jewish history, I became fascinated by a specific period in Southern Jewish history as it relates to love and romance, the middle of the 20th century, from about the 1930s to the 1970s and beyond. Following World War II, as American Jews were becoming more affluent and more assimilated into American life, many Jewish adults had anxiety about the Jewish future. anxiety that got placed on teenagers and young adults. This is a time when Southern and American Jews were reinvesting in existing rituals, traditions, and attitudes meant to enforce endogamy, which means marrying within the faith or within a cultural group. This episode is all about those structures, what they look like, and what they do and don't accomplish. We're going to take a critical look at what this emphasis on Jewish continuity actually does. And along the way, we'll meet folks who have found Jewish partners and spouses in the South. An enormous disclaimer here is that this episode is pretty gender normative and heteronormative. That's because the rituals and traditions we're talking about are designed to encourage heterosexual partnerships, and they leave out folks who don't fit into that model. I'll also mention that this episode is an exploration of how Southern Jews have met and fallen in love with other Jews. But many Southern Jews are in wonderful partnerships with non-Jews, and there's no wrong way to live a Jewish life or have a Jewish romance. So that's our first critical lens on all of this, and there's more to come. I also want to say up front that we'll be talking about sexual harassment and sexual assault in this episode. We won't be going into any specifics, but please be mindful that content is in the episode and do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Now that we're on the same page, let's begin our exploration. Using interviews with experts and some selections from the ISJL's oral history collection, which you've already seen, we're investigating the ways in which Southern and American Jews have invested in rituals that enforce endogamy. From Ballyhoo to Bumble, let's dive into stories of Southern Jewish romance. One of the first things that folks might think about when we talk about Southern Jewish romance is the courtship weekends that were commonplace in the South, beginning in the 1930s and really hitting a peak around World War II. Jewish social clubs would host gatherings for young Jews, and people would travel from across the region to attend weekend-long parties that culminated in formal dances. These events included Jubilee in Birmingham, Alabama, Ballyhoo in Atlanta, Holidays in Columbus, Georgia, and the Falcon Picnic in Montgomery, Alabama. In 1998, Catherine Weiner, who, along with her husband Julian, was the first co-chair of the board of the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience and is currently a board member emerita of the Institute of Southern Jewish Life, spoke to ISJL oral historian David Sampliner about her experiences at Montgomery's Falcon in the years following World War II.
Well, it was from what I gather from talking to Dad and talking to that generation, there was a large Jewish community and a great number of Alsatian Jews in Montgomery, and they had their own social life, their own clubs, which evolved into the Falcon Club, which then later went on to have its own little subset of the Jubilee in Birmingham and the Ballyhoo in Atlanta, of which I would go up whenever they had the big weekends and parties and such. But this was a wonderful get-together for the Southern Jews, which certainly preceded the Jewish camps, because this is where people sent their male children and female children to meet eligible children of teenagers, people in their 20s. And there is a book which we found of Dad's letters to his sister, his youngest sister, who was away at college, talking about the social life in Montgomery. And it was just, I mean, every night there seemed to be a party.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the parties themselves and the ones that you attended and recollections from that?
Well, the year I graduated from high school, which was 1946, was the first year after World War II that Falcon became, again, a reality, because all the eligible men, of course, were in service during World War II, and there were so many problems with no music, because all the other people who were playing the music were in service. So between, I guess, 1940 and 1946, when I was much too young to attend these things anyhow, there were no parties. But in 1946, my brother and a number of people decided it was time to revive these, and they went anywhere to mild to wild, I guess, because there were generally, as I was growing up in Montgomery, 4 slots for dances. There was a Saturday, a tea dance, and a regular dance, and a picnic and barbecue on Sunday, and another dance. And if there were enough eligible men around or enough eligible women, you not only had late dates, you had late dates. And sometimes your head just never touched the pillow. And occasionally we'd get out of our ball clothes into our bathing suits and go swimming. I mean, it was just a coffee at the Tidal House and breakfast, and off we'd go for another late date.
Falcon was the dances in Montgomery?
In Montgomery.
Was Falcon held anywhere else in the South?
No, Falcon was in Montgomery, and at the time that I'm speaking of, it was July the 4th weekend. And then the Jubilee was the Labor Day weekend, and Ballyhoo was over Christmas vacation.
Jubilee was in Birmingham.
Right.
Ballyhoo was in Atlanta.
Right.
Do you know of any others that were held in the South?
There was one in Columbus, but Columbus was just a club that had a dance, and it was generally a couple of days before Ballyhoo, because I had gone from one to the other. I'd go over to Columbus for their dance and then drive up to Atlanta. So, but as I say, the society, the Jewish society, was very vibrant.
How old were the folks that attended Falcon? What age group did it?
Eligible.
Which started at about what age?
Well, we used to say to the girls from Atlanta who came down from Atlanta smoking and drinking at 14 were a little bit beyond the way we were brought up by our Victorian parents. But usually they went from about 17 on into their 20s. And by the time you were 23 in those days, you were well over the hill if you were a female. Now, the men were very desirable at 23, especially after the war, when they'd put in a good 4 or 5 years in service. But
were any of these events chaperoned? Who organized them?
the people in the towns, usually there was a committee of people who attended. They weren't chaperoned, but the wonderful thing was that the Standard Club, which still exists, it's no longer an exclusively Jewish country club, but it was in those days. It was built with a large dance floor that was 2 stories, and there was a balcony around, and all the older ladies sat around to see in the days of stag lines which girl got cut in the most. So it may not have been chaperoned by planning, but it sure was chaperoned de facto.
Who might you expect to come into Montgomery on that weekend?
People from Atlanta, Columbus, Birmingham, sometimes the Mississippi Delta, New Orleans, Shreveport, Monroe, Mobile. Just generally, you could just about draw about a 200-mile radius. But of course, as I say, they did come in from Shreveport and maybe Lake Charles. And they were generally either French or German Jews whose families hoped that they would meet other ones. And
were Eastern European, Polish, and Russian Jews excluded? Did they just know not to show up? Why the mix the way it was?
Well, I think Alfred Urey brings that out, from what I understand, pretty well in the last night of Ballyhoo. But that's just kind of the way it was.
So let's talk about Ballyhoo, perhaps the most famous of these courtship weekends because of its immortalization in Alfred Urey's The Last Night of Ballyhoo. A follow-up to Urey's 1987 play Driving Miss Daisy, The Last Night of Ballyhoo tells the story of the Freytag family, an affluent German-Jewish family that is very assimilated into white Christian Atlanta. It's Christmas 1939, the eve of World War II, and the premiere of Gone with the Wind is in full swing. But for the Freytags, nothing is more important than Ballyhoo, where cousins Lala and Sonny are expected to find eligible Jewish partners from good families. Lala, who is enthralled by the romance of Gone with the Wind and Ballyhoo itself, begins the play decorating the family's Christmas tree in the parlor. Her cousin Sonny, a student at Wellesley who is far less enthusiastic about all of this, is on her way home for Christmas break. In the midst of all of this, the girls' Uncle Adolf brings a new employee over for dinner. Played by Paul Rudd in the original Broadway production, Joe Farkas is a New York native with Eastern European Jewish heritage. The culture clash between Joe's overt Jewishness and the Freytags' desire to assimilate is at the heart of the story. This gets at a very real part of Southern Jewish romance, this idea of mixed marriages between Jewish people from different backgrounds. I want you to experience this for yourself, so I called in a favor from Beth Kander and Danny Dauphin, a married couple who met thanks to their involvement in the small but vibrant theater scene here in Jackson, Mississippi. In this scene, early in the play, Beth plays Sunny on the train from Massachusetts to Atlanta. Danny plays Joe, who gets on the train in Baltimore. I'll let them take it from here.
Yes?
You Miss Freitag? Sonny Freitag?
Yes?
Joe Farkas, pleased to meet you.
I don't understand.
Uncle Adolph asked me to look in on you.
What?
See if you need anything.
Oh, thank you.
What?
What?
What do you need?
Oh, nothing.
Because he gave me a little extra cash if you...
No.
You sure?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
What are you reading?
The Prophets of Religion, Upton Sinclair.
Upton Sinclair, huh? The glorious unwashed masses and the beauty of the working class. You really enjoy reading this stuff?
Yes.
Eugene V. Debs, too?
Yes.
Oh, boy.
What?
Well, I sure didn't peg you for a communist.
Reading Sinclair and Debs doesn't make a person a communist.
Oh, you don't know my Uncle Velvel.
Uncle what?
Velvel.
Velvel.
Jewish for William?
Oh. Well, I'm not a communist.
Oh, that's a relief.
I'm a sociology major.
Yeah, Wellesley, I know.
Who told you?
Your family. I work for Mr. A.
Mr. A.
Uncle Adolph.
In Baltimore.
Atlanta.
You don't sound like Atlanta.
Oh, sorry.
No, I didn't mean. I just... Never mind.
You do.
I do what?
Sound like Atlanta. It's nice.
Oh.
So I happen to be in town on a little business, and Mr. A said, would I mind giving you a look-see in case you needed something? What's the matter?
Nothing.
Oh, come on.
It boggles the mind.
What?
I'm a junior at Wellesley with an A- average, and Uncle Adolph still treats me like a baby.
Why do you say that?
He didn't even think I can take a train home by myself.
Oh, I think he just loves you a lot. And I really did just happen to be in Baltimore. So how come the minus?
What?
You mentioned your average was an A minus.
I had trouble with zoology last year. What was yours?
0. Didn't go. Well, I did, kind of. I went to art school.
Don't they have grades in art school?
I guess. I was only there for 5 weeks.
Why?
My father died. I had to go to work.
Oh, no, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, well, it was a long time ago.
Well, I hope you kept up with your artwork.
When I get the chance. I guess you've got a lot lined up over your Christmas vacation.
A lot of work.
So you won't be going to this Ballyhoo thing?
Did Uncle Adolph tell you about that?
No, your cousin, Lala.
Really?
Yeah, and she was dropping plenty of hints.
Hints?
I think she wants me to take her.
Oh, and?
I pretty well sidestepped that issue.
You were smart.
How's that?
Ballyhoo is asinine.
Yeah? Why?
Oh, you know, a lot of dressed up Jews dancing around wishing they could kiss their elbows and turn into Episcopalians.
Sounds pretty terrible.
It is.
Want to go with me? Word is, I'm a pretty good dancer.
I'm not.
Baloney. I gotta go to work. Think it over.
These courtship weekends are just one example of the communal investment in connecting young Jews who are spread out across the South. Another important institution is Jewish summer camp. Check out episode 3 of the ISJL Virtual Vacation, Summer Camp Magic, for an in-depth look at the development of Jewish summer camp. Within and beyond the Jewish community, it's well known that camp is a place where teens and young adults are pursuing romance and exploring their sexuality in a relatively safe and free environment. To learn more about this phenomenon, I talked to Sandra Fox, a historian of American Jewish culture with a particular focus on post-war Jewish camp from the 1940s to the 1970s. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that between the time when I spoke with Sandra and when this episode is premiering, the Union for Reform Judaism released the results of a third-party investigation into sexual misconduct by URJ employees. Jewish camp is one of the many arenas in which sexual misconduct was identified. This is an issue with which the community is still grappling. This is an ongoing process of investigation and accountability. If you have experienced or witnessed sexual harassment, abuse, or misconduct, even if it was years ago, you can reach out to report@urj.org. To give us some context for this conversation, I asked Sandra to talk about what Jewish summer camp looked like immediately after World War II.
For quite a while, historians were really writing about the post-war moment, this moment right after World War II, where Americans, particularly white Americans, are coming back from the war. They're benefiting off of various government programs to get housing, to go to school, and in many ways being catapulted into the middle class with this help as a golden period for American Jews. It's this moment where Jews establish more organizations. They move to the suburbs and they build synagogues with all these different associations within the synagogue and the Hebrew school and the Jewish Community Center and all of these sort of institutions that we still consider to be sort of bedrocks of Jewish life. And of course, all of that is true. And of course, there's a lot of upsides to becoming middle class, becoming more affluent, becoming more socially accepted in American society. But there were also a lot of Jews who identified several downsides to that. A lot of Jewish leaders, rabbis, educators, and so forth were concerned that especially the young people the children and teens who would never have come to understand Jewish life through living in a sort of tight-knit urban Jewish neighborhood, or, before that, living in Europe or living in Palestine or Israel, how would these young Jews become sort of authentic or ideal Jews in the molds of these different kind of ideologies, whether that's, similar to Israelis, whether that's similar to Yiddish-speaking Jews of earlier in the 20th century. And with that came a lot of anxiety about the future of Jewish life. I mean, it's cliche to say it, but the youth are the future, and usually a community or a society's anxieties about the future get projected most onto youth. I mean, everything that happens in the education system or in any place that deals with youth is sort of a microcosm for thinking about the anxieties of the adults who run these institutions, teach these students. So camp life really became a sort of tableau for dealing with all of the anxieties of post-war suburban affluence. How are you going to make Jewish youth into the kinds of Jews you want them to be, whether that's in a specific religious mold or political mold? Well, there's no better place to do it than a summer camp, people believed, because you have control over the entire day, or at least theoretically, you have control over the entire day for these children for an entire month, maybe even 2 months. I mean, it's just very immersive. It's very totalizing in a way that the school is not. And that's how camps really became identified as what I would say are like panacea to communal ills, just a kind of cure-all, a Yiddish pill, a Hebrew pill, a Jewish pill, that's supposed to solve all of these different problems. And then beyond the post-war period, that continued.
So in this moment in the 1940s and 1950s and beyond, what does camp dating culture look like?
One of the things I found most interesting about doing oral histories with former campers, I did about 40 oral histories in all across the generations, or not across the generations, but across the decades of camp. So people who went in the 50s and people who went through the 70s. And what I found fascinating is actually that the sort of sexual activity that happened at camp was not that different between those decades. So, we have this impression of the sexual revolution in the 60s. And of course, that is all true. But for the most part, the sort of activities, the sexual activities that teenage campers are doing are pretty similar, mostly sexual touch and making out and things like this, but not going all the way to intercourse. What changes over that period is, first of all, the openness with which people talk about or joke about sex in camp life, the openness that staff, educators and people at the higher end, the higher sides of the power pyramid talk about what they think appropriate sexual behavior should be. In fact, they're actually a little bit more nervous about sexual activity at camp as the sexual revolution occurs, because there's this idea, well, maybe now they actually will have sex at camp, and that's sort of this hard line, we don't want campers going home pregnant, etc. But camp life also, it reflected, on the one hand, all of these American goings on with the sexual revolution. It reflected the youth who came to camp expecting and desiring of first romantic and sexual experiences. And it also came to increasingly reflect a sort of communal agenda around campers developing a sort of idea of marrying within the faith. Not necessarily that they would marry someone they met at camp, although of course in those decades that was even more possible than today. Now people get married a lot later. Back then, a teenage camper or a young counselor might actually stay with their person and get married in their 20s. But it was more about kind of developing a taste for Jewish dating, honestly. Sort of a funny term, but it is sort of about that, like having positive sexual and romantic experiences at camp will encourage them to seek those experiences later on as they look for their life partners. So romance and sexuality at camp is just always reflecting all of these elements, the American element, the specifically Jewish communal element, and of course, what children and teenagers desire, which is often having those first romantic experiences, that first kiss, that first whatever it is, within the sort of safety of camp, but also within the freedom of camp, because you don't have parents around, and Jewish camps have specifically allowed campers to have these opportunities. There haven't been historically a lot of limits placed on camper sexuality.
This focus on sex and romance is often driven by the campers, by what many teens and young adults are interested in doing when left to their own devices. But it's also supported really intentionally by the structure of camp itself.
The structures, I would say, are most core to what allows, what camps on an official level have allowed in order to encourage romance and sexuality to flourish, would be things like socials, camp dances, which I think especially in the 50s, 60s, and 70s happened maybe more often than they do today with camps. They happen very frequently, like once a week in a lot of cases. And then usually camps had a big banquet at the end of the summer. And creating that situation encouraged dating in a lot of ways, because you would want to, you'd want the campers to ask a girl or a boy, usually a girl, to the dance. Although sometimes there were Sadie Hawkins dances where the girls were supposed to ask the boys. Of course, this is all very gender normative, but so dances are a huge part of this, is sort of creating a romantic context. Other activities like around the campfire. So, oral history participants would tell me about sitting around the campfire singing Israeli songs and canoodling with their partner, like a girl lying in a boy's lap, and that they would even be doing sort of sexual touch right there, like in front of people, but in the dark, in this sort of like public private moment that is, allowed. It's known that this is happening, and it's allowed that this, it's sort of part of the structure of camp life. Other examples are the role of fake marriage ceremonies. So there's sort of a camping tradition that dates back to, I think I know that in the Catskills, for instance, people would put on fake Jewish weddings just to create the context for a party. So some camps would do this too, and they would have counselors sort of role playing, a bride and a groom and make it really festive. And some camps would also give campers a chance to discuss the elements of the ceremony and use that as a jumping off point for more direct education about Jewish marriage. But also camp carnivals would have like fake marriage booths. So I think I'm going to name this chapter in the book Summer Flings and Fuzzy Rings, which I hope some people will get, but like fake engagement or wedding rings made out of pipe cleaner that was fuzzy, and giving campers this opportunity to fake marry the boy or the girl or the friend that they liked. It was often like treated also platonically. And you could say, okay, that's not really like an element of a messaging, that's not educational messaging. But I think if you take the idea of hidden curriculum seriously, the idea that, everything that's happening with an educational context is sort of pedagogical, then I think that this emphasis put on Jewish marriage is very clear, and you see it in various ways. I'd say two of the last elements are the fact that the genders were really just mixed together the entire day in most of these camps. So you have separate bunks, but almost all activities are happening coeducationally. So that's not, directly encouraging romance, but it's certainly not discouraging it. It's giving campers, ample opportunity to get to know the opposite sex. Again, sorry that this is so heteronormative, but this is the time period, this is the essence of the time period. And then the last thing is sort of this period at night before lights out. The end of the final activity of the day, there would be this period where campers could walk each other back to their bunks. I think if a camp really had control in mind, if they didn't want campers to be coupling off and having sexual experiences, they would make sure that the bunk walks back together. I know that some camps do this now. I know that some camps did this back then selectively, if an activity ended late and they needed to get the kids back to bed. But overall, there was sort of this period at most camps where it was sort of like, okay, well, now it's 10. By 10:30, you need to be back in your bunks and getting ready for bed. Well, giving campers a chance to walk around in the dark is a form of permitting sexual activity to occur. Again, this is kind of an awesome sex positive element, you could say, of American Jewish culture, that this is allowed to go on. And of course it also had, it could apply pressure on campers who might not be ready for that kind of experience. So I would find, rarely, because archives are never complete and like people often didn't write these things down, it might have been a conversation that happened between camp leaders on the side, never to be recorded, never to be seen by a historian. But I have some examples of letters between camp staff members, head staff members at the end of the summer, analyzing how things went and talking about this period. At one camp, or mock camp at least, they called it Otsar, which means treasure. This Otsar period, treasure period. And they would talk about like, what was the right amount of freedom for what age group, and what do you do about these kids who are feeling the pressure, who don't have a girlfriend or a boyfriend and having a negative experience because of that, or just feeling sort of like they're late bloomers. So that period of the day is really an indication, I think, of camp's overall encouragement of romantic and sexual exploration.
But the emphasis on romance at camp also has a darker side.
In terms of my historical research, I did hear from several of the former campers I spoke with that the sort of romantic and sexual focus of camp life, whether that was, encouragement among, the teens themselves, which of course there was that element of desire, of interest, of making it a focal point within sort of camper culture, or it was from the top down, that could apply like very intense and sometimes negative pressure on them. Girls telling me about the anxieties they felt about their looks, boys telling me about sort of just the crude sexual humor in the bunk, which they often enjoyed at the time, but maybe looked back at as problematic, or, pressure on, just a tremendous focus on sort of sexual development, who was doing what and when, and how far they were going. Sort of this idea that the normal camper should be advancing to a certain place, if you're thinking about the 4 bases, right? So one former camper said to me that when they got older, they found out that pretty much no one in their summer camp was having sex as a teenager. But the idea that people were having sex, the rumor that people were having sex, was very powerful. And it made it a sort of goal, and it made it sort of a benchmark of like, are you cool? Are you mature? Are you becoming an adult? So that's one element that people spoke about, just sort of the negative pressure it could put on you for looks reasons, for popularity reasons. And of course, the possibility of advancing before you feel truly ready because of all those pressures. The other thing that people spoke about was sort of the blurring of boundaries between campers and staff, which there was much less awareness of course, about back then, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It wouldn't be as, it wasn't viewed as problematic for, let's say, a young counselor or a kitchen staff member to have a relationship with an older teen camper. I mean, even when I went to camp in the early 2000s, that was happening, wasn't per se allowed, but it was happening and people knew it was happening. Obviously, the Me Too era has changed a lot of that and has made people think about, what does the focus on curbing intermarriage do to Jewish youth? What does it cause in the camp environment or the youth group environment that might not be totally positive? I think part of that is, not taking seriously the possible abuses of power within the camp environment, relations between staff and teenagers. But even more so, just the pressure that the youth themselves feel to sort of perform, to have these relationships, to advance sexually, to have something to talk about when they come back to the bunk. And how that can create a sort of, a pressure cooker that encourages sexual behavior that not everyone's ready for at that age. Again, like, I'm a very sex positive person, so this can be a complicated balance, right? Like, on the one hand, it's awesome that, there's not a lot of shame around sexuality at camp, but on the other hand, it can create an environment that is intensely high pressure for teens, encouraging them to do things they might not be ready to do. Peer pressure is a huge part of it. And of course, it can create a context for different kinds of sexual abuse or harassment. So it definitely does have that sort of negative side. And camps are working, I know, very hard now to be thinking more intentionally about the environments they're creating and what it means to be sort of both sex positive and encourage exploration romantically and sexually, and also keeping campers safe, making sure they don't feel pressure, making camps feel good for LGBTQ campers is a huge thing right now, in a way that it was obviously not in the post-war period. I mean, I spoke to former campers who later came out as gay and lesbian, but none of them were at the time. And often had complicated relationships with camper culture around sexuality because of that.
I am personally and professionally invested in the experiences of queer Jews, and I'm especially interested in thinking about how LGBTQ Jews experienced this romantic camp environment. This moment in teens' lives is often a time for really important experimentation and exploration of sex and sexuality, but for queer Jews in the mid-20th century, it wasn't really possible for them to be out at camp.
I think historically speaking, in the oral histories I conducted, the people I spoke with, everyone had really, really different experiences. So some people, like I said, no one came out at camp as gay or lesbian. That was not a safe environment, or very few environments were safe. Most of them came out, or all of them came out in college or later. I think as was quite typical at the time. But the experiences they had on the ground at camp were interesting, and they were all very different. I mean, some of them were not yet aware or not yet able to articulate what their sexuality was or what was going on with them inside, and others were aware. And those are two very different experiences. So, a former camper who later came out and identified as a lesbian told me about having these really intense friendships at camp, girls that would hold hands with each other or cuddle and sleep in the same bed. And that only later did she kind of come to assimilate that information and realize that those were crushes, or that those were, for her, not entirely platonic. And there were people who had sexual relationships at camp with the same sex as staff members, but, couldn't talk about it, or if they eventually were found out by people on the staff, were told to not talk about it, to hide it. So really a diverse range of experiences. None of them particularly unique to camping. I think they're just indicative of the time period. I think that's important to say. None of them said, oh, camp was specifically a negative experience. I'm sure there were people who had that, right? But of the 5 people I'm talking about here, none of them specifically said that camp was a negative experience for them. And for a lot of them, it was a overall positive experience, but very much indicative of the time period overall. And their trajectories after camp were very similar, I think, to the kind of average experience back then of coming out a little bit later in adulthood, or maybe not being able to come out entirely, to your family, and having to live still somewhat in the closet. So it was a real range. I can't really summarize it in one way.
Sandra Fox's book, The Jews of Summer, is coming out in February 2023 with Stanford University Press. I'm so excited to read even more of her insights about this really important Jewish institution. I hope that you're following where I'm going with this story, that while these traditions and institutions that enforce endogamy have resulted in many wonderful partnerships, they're also rooted in concerns about Jewish continuity and Jewish survival that can be incredibly damaging, especially to women. In July 2018, the Jewish Week published the stories of 8 women who accused prominent Jewish sociologist Stephen M. Cohen of sexual harassment. In response to these allegations and the reckoning this prompted in the Jewish community, scholars Lila Corwin-Berman, Kate Rosenblatt, and Ronit Stahl published an op-ed in the Forward exploring the historical basis of Jewish social science, tracing a direct line from narratives about Jewish continuity to the environment in Jewish academia and other institutions that allowed this misconduct and harassment to occur. These 3 scholars followed up their initial article with a more in-depth study published in American Jewish History in 2020. I caught up with Lila, Ronit, and Kate to talk about their work and the historical basis for these ideas about Jewish continuity. First, I asked them to talk about the origins of their work and why it's so necessary.
It was so striking that here is this person who had really defined so much of the conversation about what people call Jewish continuity and the problems of intermarriage and the problems of low birth rate among certain groups of especially educated American Jewish women. And then he was involved in these really problematic relationships with women and with his sort of sense of how he could control women in certain ways. And so we just started to think about kind of the discourse that he had created in light of what had happened.
Part of what we were then attempting to do, and we wrote an op-ed for kind of broad public consumption, and then went deeper in academic work and then was in conversation with other scholars about it, was unpack some of the assumptions that had long just been present in scholarship that then filtered into community life. And really because of the world of Jewish studies being connected, as Lila was saying, to a lot of the Jewish communal interest in studying Jewish communities, that, when you use shorthands and when you make assumptions, they lead to sometimes concrete policy, but more often culture. And that this is then, assumptions coming from academics can influence Jewish community life, and Jewish community concerns can influence academic scholarship in ways that in other realms, people studying communities of which they are more distant chronologically, geographically, communally, would actually take the time to possibly unpack and to think through, to interrogate in ways that I think part of what we were getting at hadn't been done. So the scholarly work we did was really tracing this discourse and seeing where are these concerns about continuity coming from, what assumptions are embedded in them, and especially but not exclusively about Jewish women.
Many of us, whether we are in the Jewish communal world or not, have heard this term Jewish continuity. It gets thrown around a lot, and I think many folks don't know where it comes from and how it evolved over time.
In the early post-war period, American Jewish communities are attuned to the methods of social science, and they're learning the skills of polling that are happening elsewhere in American life, right? This is the era in which sort of the very technology of, say, like Pew data emerges. And so Jews, like other Americans, really pick up on this and begin sort of turning their gaze to Jewish communities to sort of figure out what's going on. And out of this data emerges deep concerns about the future and a sensibility that the Jewish future is imperiled in certain kinds of ways, particularly because of falling birth rates, but also in the context of other kinds of communal concerns, particularly about the Holocaust, I would argue, and about the way that the politics of the early Cold War
centered families in ways that made sense to Jews, that really resonated with Jews. So all of this counting, I think, sort of attuned people to potential problems, and the community responded in really significant ways, trying, I think, to address, how could we ensure a vibrant and numerically strong Jewish future? And they came up with lots of ways, actually, as it turns out, lots of programs and lots of policies and lots of aspirations. But ultimately, I think our critique sort of rests on the argument, right, that all of those sort of solutions to this so-called problem, and I say so-called because I'm not actually convinced that it was a crisis, it's a discourse of crisis, that lots of those kinds of so-called solutions placed a particular kind of burden on Jewish women. It pointed fingers, it blamed them, and it said, your behavior is problematic because your behavior is imperiling the Jewish future. And that kind of finger pointing, I think, is one of the hallmarks of this discourse, this sort of placing blame squarely on the shoulders of women, as opposed to understanding issues of birth rates as involving everyone, right, as a communal problem.
There are different ways to envision a Jewish future, and there's certainly a desire to maintain Jewish community. The question is, of course, how do you do that? And who becomes responsible for doing it? And what's the support structure for making it happen? In the United States at this time, it's also a moment where Jews are becoming more integrated into the social and religious fabric of the United States. So it is not devoid of anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic policies, restrictive covenants, and this sort of thing. But at the same time, American Jews are more integrated and have social connections that they're not, they're moving, they're suburbanizing like many others. They're part of larger patterns. And also part of these larger patterns are Jewish women pursuing education, being in the university, making choices about their futures, their careers, and their bodies. And this elicits anxiety, to put it mildly, panic from others about what's happening. So as Katie was saying, we get a lot of anxiety about especially what Jewish women are doing. Who are Jewish women marrying? How many children are they producing? The responsibility for the Jewish future is in many ways assumed to be in the hands, or at least the wombs, of women. But the question, of course, is, what supports this? Is it okay if Jewish men kind of have their, from some perspectives, dalliances with non-Jewish women, while Jewish women are expected, perhaps conscripted in certain ways, into marrying Jewish men to produce Jewish babies? Where's the sort of, who's telling people what to do? Who's blaming who for not doing what expectations are? Generally, amongst educated Americans, the age of marriage is rising, the age of first childbearing is rising, the access to birth control is increasing. A lot of this, not just in Jewish communities, but writ large, is then ascribed to women, sometimes for powerful reasons related to feminism, right? And the ability of women to claim and stake their futures. But, that comes with backlash, and that backlash is not, the Jewish community is not exempt from that backlash and that concern over what Jewish women are doing, and how Jewish women then may be the ones, from some perspectives, imperiling the Jewish future.
So given all of this, what are the assumptions we're making about young Jews, and how do these play out in communal spaces?
I think there's one guiding presumption which is that, if you could just get Jews together, right? Like at a baseline, right? Get the high schoolers together, get the college students together, get, recent college grads, put them in the same place. If you just put them with other Jews, then I don't know, their natural, horniness will take over, and they'll, and they'll obviously choose one another, get married, and in a few years have babies, and they'll go, to the Jewish preschool, whether it's at the JCC or the synagogue or wherever, and, they'll be then in this cycle. There's a lot of presumptions embedded, in that, even, and that I don't think people necessarily even realize. Like, I think sometimes there are programs, and Birthright is one that was intentionally designed, like both about connection between American Jews and Israel, but also really about getting, Jewish people in their teens and 20s, like in the same place, right? And the expectation that that would lead to relationships and ultimately marriage and children. And again, I think youth groups and camps do the same thing. Hillel on campus, there are spaces where the expectation is that if you create social connection, you will also create marriage and children. And again, I think, we may want to think critically about what's embedded in that. And then especially in a time where we are paying much more attention to Me Too, sexual harassment, sexual assault, sexual misconduct, what happens in spaces where the guiding assumption is that these Jews should get together? And we hear stories, we talked about a few of them, but lots of people have them about the really uneven power dynamics. And what happens in places where it's expected. I mean, there are really terrible stories that are coming out, especially from youth groups, about Hillel, other spaces, like what's conventions, what's happening in terms of how, especially women, again, and it's like women who are objectified, what happens when, women are blamed for not marrying Jews, and men are sort of let off the hook for the decisions they make, be it about harassment, about who they date, and what's accepted or not. And so, there's a lot going on. And I think what we are seeing right now is people paying much more attention to, it's not always all good, right? Like there's an assumption, whatever you think about Jewish continuity, there's also an assumption that these spaces are sort of halcyon and it's like innocent. If you just put Jews in the same place, they'll make really good decisions. And we should be really thinking about what are those decisions, sort of the trope of the nice Jewish guy, like what's happening in these spaces, and what responsibility does a community have for shaping spaces that create thoughtful, ethical people, whether or not they make the decisions that the community wants them to.
The rise of anxiety and discourse about Jewish continuity intersects with the rise of second-wave feminism in the 1970s and 1980s.
Well, second-wave feminism transforms the world, right? Like the movement for liberation changes all of the possibilities for what women can do and be. And I think a lot of Jewish women really take advantage of that. I think they enter higher education in huge numbers. They enter professions. And, I think that the sort of push outward, right, that really comes out of second wave feminism of imagining a world where women could be fully integrated, really poses a challenge for communities, well, quite frankly, that oftentimes operate on the unpaid labor of women, right? And I think a question we could ask at all points in the Jewish past is how women's labor enables the very functioning of the communal structures of which men are so proud of and so inclined to protect. And so, there's this one moment from one of our, we cite this in our article, but there's this newspaper article that details this young woman in a ballroom, in a conference sponsored by a federation, who sort of says, I am getting a job and sort of extols the reality of what that's done for her as a human. And a rabbi on stage says, okay, yes, but just know that you are dooming the Jewish future, right? And that kind of dynamic, I think, it's not often that we have such a sort of explicit example, but I think what we are arguing is that sort of dynamic plays out sort of on the ground in major ways and also in very sort of, under the table ways, right? In ways that culture is able to really powerfully communicate to people expectations and desires and pressure. So, I think that instead of seeing second wave feminism as a moment in which Jewish women had all of these opportunities, the Jewish community instead sees this kind of opening as really threatening. And in fact, they might have been right, right? In other words, the changes that are happening actually are asking Jewish communities to ask different questions and maybe find different solutions to those questions that they have previously settled on. And so I think at its sort of base, right, second wave feminism's liberatory sort of, trajectory, really butts up against, well, to use Lila's language, the sort of the effort to conserve, right, something that had been. It's not all that surprising to me as someone who studies second wave feminism that Jewish women get blamed, right? We could see everywhere in American culture also where women take the blame, right, for the changes that are that are occurring in this period. So in many ways, it's not surprising, but still, I think, worthwhile contemplating what it means to be part of a community and to constantly be told that your choices to live your life as you choose on your terms is causing harm.
I think everything Kate said is really, really important to understand about kind of the period in which this continuity discourse is really kind of forming. So its very formation is completely entangled with second wave feminism. And one of the things that's like puzzling and perplexing, and I think really interesting, is that, among the kinds of Jewish institutions that end up being the exponents of Jewish continuity discourse tend to be Jews who are very educated, tend to be Jews who would self-characterize as liberal, tend to be Jews who would say that they're supportive of feminism. And so I think that ends up being a really tricky space of this, that it's not as if in those kinds of spaces of federation and in the synagogues that we were looking at, which tend to be the more conservative or reform synagogues, that people were saying, I disagree with everything about second wave feminism. I mean, occasionally that happened, but many of them, in fact, were saying that they believe in these things. And so what ends up happening is there's this like discourse that is operating sort of counter to some of the avowed or stated politics. And so in a way that ends up being like, people now talk about sort of, a woman who should be able to do it all and have it all, so on one hand, girls should be excelling academically and going to college and having jobs, and being career oriented, and that's all good and that's all modern and whatever. But at the same time, they're really messing things up for the continuity of the Jewish people. And so they should be also having babies and getting married at a younger age and all of these things. And so this sort of like focus on women as both like, being able to show the kind of liberal modernity of Jewishness, but also as being blamed for not, kind of doing those traditional roles. That's also like, in really good scholarship about Jewish women in history, that kind of double pressure on them is something that, has been noted from earlier periods, right? 18th and 19th century, where women were seen as both like too modern and not modern enough. And I think there's a way in which that's like really replicated and then creates a blindness. Right. And it's a little bit of the blindness. No, I can't be X because some of my best friends are whatever. No, I'm a feminist. I'm very liberal. I would never be somebody who would, put women in a position where they're meant to do anything other than adhere to those values. And yet this whole vocabulary itself is premised upon a really different sense of what women are supposed to be doing. And it does not include a sense of, okay, if you think that women should be able to kind of follow the pathways that feminism is opening for them and should also be encouraged to have families and to be mothers, then you maybe need to think about some of the ways that you can make that structurally possible, right? Which has to do with advocating for policies like childcare, right, being something that is available for more and more people and is not, something that so many people would necessarily be priced out of. or all sorts of kinds of shifts to actually create a culture that values children and families and parenting. But because of that disconnect, because it's like, yeah, no, I'm feminist, and I really believe in this continuity thing, sort of ends up being this big dodge around the actual changes that would have to happen.
Imagine the effect on a Jewish birth rate, right, of say universal childcare and equal pay. I mean, like those two things alone, in many ways, the sort of legislative centerpieces of second wave feminism that we're still waiting for, would have enabled exactly the kind of world, right, the Jewish communal world that Lila just described.
I'm curious about how Jewish institutions might look if we thought more deeply about the ways in which narratives about Jewish continuity are damaging to the very people we're trying to support. In other words, given what we know, what can our institutions become?
I actually see a lot of value in a lot of youth groups and trips and things like that. Like, I don't, necessarily have a problem with it, but I think that the thing I hope will change is the sense of pressure put on those kinds of spaces. And I think one manifestation of that pressure is this sort of enforced intimacy, that like once you're there for those 10 days, like you are supposed to feel everything and experience everything and do everything. And I think that ends up sometimes doing real harm, sometimes real violence to people who, for whatever reason, encounter situations of power asymmetry, encounter situations where their concerns are not being taken seriously because the frame of those experiences is so predetermined.
In the wake of what we wrote, I will say quite a few people reached out to me to just kind of share their experiences. And so I want to echo Lila's point that a lot of harm has been done in ways that, again, remain invisible, and no one has to share their trauma publicly. But I think communally, there has to be a reckoning with the fact that these spaces have really enabled a lot of misconduct. And that's just putting it mildly. So, I think, what does it mean to transform spaces to alleviate the pressures that I think helped enable a lot of the power dynamics and sexual harassment that has happened. And again, it's not limited to the Jewish community. We see this in all sorts of institutional spaces. What are the ways in which communities can build a robust sense of belonging without sort of enforcing boundaries and engaging in types of gatekeeping that make people afraid to speak up and that enable bad behavior, I think is really important.
I mean, I guess the last thing I would say is something sort of more explicitly academic, which is about methodology, which is that much of the Jewish past has been written through exclusively Jewish archives, right? Through looking exclusively at Jewish communities and being attuned, right, to other modes of investigation, right? Not all Jews show up in Jewish spaces, right? And I think those are valuable Jews too, and I'm interested and curious about their experiences and their history. And so I think this is changing already, but I'm really excited about a sort of a new generation of historians and other kinds of academics who are looking in new places for Jews and Jewish experiences in really interesting and compelling ways.
I hope that this episode has demonstrated the need for us to hold two truths in our minds. One is that these courtship weekends, summer camps, and other communal rituals have supported the development of healthy, romantic, and platonic relationships and wonderful families and communities for generations. And at the same time, they have reinforced heteronormative visions of the American family that contribute to the oppression of women and LGBTQ people and allow sexual misconduct to occur. All of this matters, and all of it has played out in the Southern and American Jewish communities. We're going to take a little bit of a turn now into one more facet of this narrative that we've been tracing together. Because I work for the Institute of Southern Jewish Life, there's one more story about Southern Jewish romance that I just have to tell. Over the 22 years that the ISJL has been in existence, a not insignificant number of people have met their life partners here in Jackson. I got to sit down with all of them, and they're going to tell you their stories.
Sure. Folks at home, I'm Allie Partial.
I'm Josh Partial.
So I'm Erin Ring, and Dan and I live in Rockville, Maryland.
Hi, I'm Michelle Chayette.
And I'm Elias Chayette.
I'm Landon.
And I'm Rena Lubin.
How did we meet, Josh?
We met at the Institute of Southern Jewish Life.
We met I was interviewing for being an education fellow for the ISJL, and so I flew down to Jackson, and we met on my interview.
I was an education fellow interviewing him.
The interview went horribly. Clearly.
The interview went obviously really well.
I did the ISJL Education Fellowship from 2010 to 12, and 5 years later, Elias did it from
2015 to 2017.
Yeah, so we both had a relationship with actually Rachel Stern, who used to oversee the ed department. And she knew that by keeping in touch with me that I was going to be starting graduate school at the same time that he was going to be. And so he said, hi. She said, hi to ISJL fellows. You're going to be in Israel together at HUC. You should meet.
We met up for lunch at a poke restaurant after your last day of work.
My last day at Houston Hillel.
And as I was going to my last ever partner visit to Beaumont, Texas.
We actually, the first night we met was the night before orientation. We both were starting the same day. And the night before, Macy Hart hosted like a welcome to Jackson pizza dinner. And that was the first time we met. Josh doesn't remember meeting me, but I remember meeting him.
It was around this time 10 years ago that Dan and I met in the Jackson airport. Dan was coming for an interview, and I was about to finish my first year pretty soon.
I remember so we first talked on the phone. I think I was in between classes, and I interviewed with Erin. I was like, this lady seems cool. All right, this seems like an interesting opportunity. I was very in awe of her professionalism. She was very serious about she was like, where are we coming back from?
Corpus Christi.
Corpus Christi. I was like, wow, this lady knows what she's doing. And I, of course, had no idea what I was doing because I was just there to interview some college kid who thought he knew everything.
Josh was the oral historian, and he did not want to spend a lot of time with the education fellows. He thought we were younger, and he thought he was cooler than us, I guess. But then over time, he realized, oh, no, we're people too to hang out with, and we became friends.
Well, you were.
After that lunch in Houston, I come back to the office. It was a full working weekend to get back to the office, and Rabbi Matt Dreffin knew that I was getting lunch with Michelle, and as a few other males in the office, I went into his office and I was like, Matt, I got to tell you about this lunch that I had with this woman. It's like, she's hot. I want to date her.
Yeah, it was kind of like we're just friends for a long time, and I invited Dan over one night, like very casual, and he was like, "Oh, I invited Ben Chadell over too," and I was like, "Oh, okay."
Well, because it was we were trying to be professional. I didn't want to you didn't want to mix those two things, especially where you work. It would get messy, So
yeah, so we were taking it very slow.
Since we worked together, we hung out for a long time before we actually started dating. There was a lot of going and having some beers and eating pizza that I think were very date-like, but not really sort of called that.
Also, these pizza and beer nights, he did think were dates, and I had no idea until later on that they were dates.
When we first started dating, it was kind of hush hush in secret, because I didn't know if people from the ISJL could date each other at first.
We didn't tell really anybody for a while, which is super fun to sort of have a secret or whatever. That lasted a couple weeks, a month. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I think we were oh, let's keep this, under, low profile or whatever. It was 2 weeks where we were able to do that without anyone finding out.
Yeah.
I would say we knew that it was a good fit immediately, because Literally, so there was a lot of time when we would hang out a lot before our first, what we call our first date. But from our first date to about a year of us dating. So for the first year of us dating, we didn't sleep apart at all. Like every night we just immediately moved in. She immediately moved in, starting at the first date. And usually that's a sign that it's a good fit. And now we live together officially on a lease. Both of our names are on the lease.
And we're engaged.
So I think that it was a good fit pretty immediately.
Basically, I got sick, and sometimes when you feel sick, you're like embarrassed to be around other people, and you feel gross. And Josh's response to me kind of like shying away from him and not wanting to be around him was like, no, you are going to be around me. And he was like pretty adamant about me not staying away from him because I was sick, but spending like even more quality time with him. And I was just like, oh, this is the kind of person I want to be with.
So Michelle's birthday was very early on in our time in Israel. I think within a week of us starting school, it was Michelle's birthday. And so she invited, which is a very nice person, invited everybody in our class to go out to lunch.
It's only 15, it's not like that.
And we went out to lunch on a Shabbat to one of the few non-kosher restaurants open on Shabbat in Jerusalem. And giant long table. And I made sure to place myself next to Michelle. Being very strategic at this moment, trying to just be around her. And we start talking about crawfish. I don't know how we started talking about crawfish, but the two of us went on and on and on. And our classmates who are going to be Jewish professionals and studying in Israel, many of them keep kosher, look at us like, what are you, crazy? You're a future rabbi, you're a future educator, you're bonding over treif? What is this?
Worth it.
Worth it. And I think that was when I was like, okay, we could be paired together. This would be pretty great if we both have this love of this kind of unique cultural experience that we've had separately.
I did, since I finished my fellowship before Dan, I was looking at jobs in various places, and then I ended up teaching at a public school in Jackson. And it was a very, very tough year. And Dan really stuck by me with that. He was extremely supportive, and I feel like I came out so much stronger. And that was like something else that was very telling, that Dan was the one.
Josh has a very strong sense of right and wrong, which sometimes can be annoying because you're like, no, there are shades of gray. But actually, in terms of parenting and making choices about the kind of values we want to instill in our kids and the way that we want to live, it's really nice to have someone who just has a clear vision of like what it means to do right. And kind of, I don't know, it's nice to navigate life with someone like that.
Yeah, I'd say Allie similarly has a pretty strong sense of what the right thing to do is, which is a product of, I think, like a real sense of responsibility towards others, and also just being really smart, so she can sort of cut through like whatever noise there is around a problem.
Anytime, we get to share stories of each other's time in Jackson, which was 5 years apart. I think that also is like a common thing that comes up all the time. It reminds me like he's the right person because he understands who I am, both like as a Jew and as a person and as an educator, in a way that a lot of people just don't.
It was definitely like, we're very sentimental when we think about our time in Mississippi and the South.
Our first kind of 4 years together here, it was my first place I lived after college. And so it was kind of this exciting time of, oh, I'm living on my own and I'm falling in love and I'm getting used to this new city. And it was a fun 4 years of just being young in a new place.
I tell Mayor, our son, he's 2.5, he sees the picture behind us. And we told him over breakfast. Aaron told him that. What'd you say?
I said it's far away and we'd have to get on an airplane to go there. And so he always points at that picture and says, far away airplane.
And I tell him, one day we'll take you there and we'll show you all the places where we met, where we met and all the places that we walked around. And he's like, one day. I'm like, yeah, you got it. One day, man.
It's fun to like drive around Jackson with our kids and say like, oh, like that was, your mom lived in that apartment, you know, when we met, or like, oh, that was my dingy little apartment when we met. And then show them like the building where we had like our apartment together, our first apartment together, which is like where we got our, you know, the first place we lived with our cats, who, you know, we really used to love our cats before we had kids. Yeah.
One of the things that we often reflect on is like having the shared experience of working at the ISJL or being connected to the ISJL in any way, I think bonds you in a different way than some other experiences maybe. So I think that is what like initially drew us to one another.
We just have immense gratitude for being able to be connected through the ISJL and meeting. Like, I mean, we talk about that all the time, and his mother always raves about that too. Like, you know, she was so nervous about her son moving so far away, but like it made her feel so good, and she's like very proud. She, you know, she tells everybody about that, how we met and how it was meant to be.
And Rabbi Matt Dreffin officiated our wedding in Galveston, which was lovely. You know, it's really hard when you work in the field, you have relationships with so many different rabbis, that to find someone that really knows like both of us, both together and separate, was really unique. And so just another continued component of our ISJL love.
I'm really torn between like resenting feeling an obligation to the ISJL for introducing me to my spouse, and also like a little bit of pride that like we were the first like couples like to actually like meet here and get married.
I've said it before, like the ISJL and being here and doing this position and meeting the people that I have met, like as cliche as it is, like has legitimately been life-changing, and like I wouldn't be where I am today with who I am today if it wasn't for that Southern Jewish experience.
There we go. There's the future program associate fellow. There you go, Seema. This is your first primetime experience.
Thank you so much to Josh Partial for his help producing this episode and working with our oral history collection. Thanks also to Sandra Fox, Lila Corwin-Berman, Kate Rosenblatt, and Ronit Stahl for lending their immense expertise. Thank you to Ali and Josh Partial, Michelle and Elias Chayette, Aaron and Dan Ring, and Rena Lubin and Landon Crawford for their amazing interviews, and of course to Beth Kander and Danny Dauphin for a remarkable performance. My thanks also to Lindsay Resnick and the Cuba Family Archives of the Bremen Museum in Atlanta, Georgia, for providing us with photographs of Ballyhoo. This project was made possible by a grant from the Mississippi Humanities Council through support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Join us on Tuesday, March 29th at 11 a.m. Central for the next episode of the ISJL Virtual Vacation. I'm in conversation with Tatiana Wechsler, a musical theater performer and Yiddish performer with roots in Atlanta. Among other accomplishments, Tatiana has the distinction of being the first woman to play the role of Curly in Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma, and she will be making her Broadway debut in the new musical Mr. Saturday Night starring Billy Crystal, which begins previews on March 29th. We'll talk about growing up Jewish in Atlanta, the role of musical theater in Tatiana's life, her explorations of Yiddish theater and music as well as Shakespeare, and the importance of celebrating Black and Jewish joy through song. You don't want to miss this one. Thank you for joining us for this ISJL program. You can learn more about all of the wonderful work we do and the many programs and resources that are at your fingertips on our website, isjl.org. We'll see you next time for more stories from the Jewish South.